Greetings comrades, so fairly recently I released a video on the fate of the Queen in 1984, and so I thought it would be interesting to consider the fate of the Pope after the Eurasian takeover in the world. Casual readers and perhaps even some veterans of the novel may be scratching their heads wondering just how we can know. Is there an obscure passage in the novel indicating his fate, or in some other Orwell canon source? Well, no, but I still believe we can consider likely scenarios based on what we do know in the lore, which may be more than first appears. In the novel, the Pope is actually mentioned, or rather the office itself, though in passing and crucially in a negative context. Winston is copying some information from a children's history book loaned to him by Mrs. Parsons, and he reads this segment, quote, "There would be mention of the bishops in their lawn sleeves, the judges in their ermine robes, the pillory, the stocks, the treadmill, the cat o' nine tails, the Lord Mayor's banquet, and the practice of kissing the Pope's toe." The king is also mentioned in the same chapter as the chief of the capitalists, which in itself, along with other things, gives us a window into the Pope's own fate. However, while you may be imagining a public trial and execution, there may be a little more to this than just that. In my previous video on the Queen's fate in Oceania, I theorised that though she would certainly have been an enemy and a prime target for capture, it may also not be completely outside of possibility that she would be used, for a time at least, by the party. Similarly, especially given his influence and similar position as a monarch, the Pope too may have submitted to the role of puppet, at least in the earlier years of Eurasian rule. This is not completely unreasonable, considering that historically, the papacy is infamous for its collaboration with the German government during World War II, though this issue is complex and controversial. What we do know is that Pope Pius XII did entertain envoys from the National Socialist regime, according to documents in the Vatican's secret archives, and he has been criticised for not speaking out more on the Holocaust and persecution of Jews. Though the papacy was officially neutral during the war too, evidence also suggests that war criminals did escape from Germany via so-called rat lines, with the assistance of the Catholic Church and the Vatican. The point here is not to attack the Church, but to bluntly state that cooperation is not impossible by any means. I personally find it a little difficult to believe that a totalitarian-controlled Europe would not bring the Vatican to the negotiating table at least, assuming they were even asked. Given the context of the aforementioned quote, you would think the Pope too would be a chief capitalist in the eyes of the Eurasians. I specify the Eurasians as we know Rome and hence the Vatican too would fall under their control sometime following the Atomic War, which was in around 1954. While we can't be certain of the exact sequence of events, a few things can be known. For example, we know the party in Oceania was in power by 1958, given we can work our way back from the 3-year plans. It's also highly likely Eurasia formed before Oceania, but after 1954's Atomic War, given we know from the law that countries and not the three superpowers fought that conflict. This gives us a rough 3 to 4 year window in which the Pope's fate would be decided. Interestingly, it is none other than Pope Pius XII himself who still reigned in our world, which may dictate just how the Church and papacy would fare. Firstly, however, given the Pope's clearly negative depiction in the party's version of history, how is there any chance of anything other than a relatively quick death, with perhaps a public trial beforehand? Well, in Goldstein's book, we do have a helpful connection that forms the basis of some assumptions in this and other videos. We know that barring slight differences, the ideology and hierarchical structure of each superstate is essentially the same. Oceania, Eurasia, and later East Asia all adhere to oligarchical collectivism, and at least on a surface level, adhere to socialist principles. Given this, we can safely translate this negative attitude from the party's history book to the neo-Bolsheviks in charge of Eurasia. Yet, while the Pope would certainly have his power severely reduced and controlled, there is some space for Pius to survive, for a while at least, and possibly even until his natural death. it depends on if the neo-Bolsheviks share the party's limited tolerance for religion in relation to their proles. In Oceania, the potential for religious toleration is there. Quote, "For that matter, even religious worship would have been permitted if the proles had shown any sign of needing or wanting it." End quote. So in Oceania, it's more a case of need rather than overtly banning it on purely ideological grounds. Given the millions of devout Catholics in their sphere of influence, I think it's quite conceivable that the Eurasian state would allow the papacy to continue for the first few years of its rule, even if just to calm the proles and help with the transition. However, unlike the agreement for toleration of the Church reached with Germany in our world, I suspect any agreement with Eurasia would be much harsher. I think it's important not to lose ourselves too much in the recent quote, as firstly, common sense is important too, and the larger ideological framework is crucial. Given the nature of the party, and likely the neo-Bolsheviks too in Eurasia, it must be seen as totally in control and infallible. This would perhaps be even more important in the first shakier years of Eurasian rule, given their power was less established and the longevity of the Church would contrast starkly with their own power. The balance would be crucial for the Eurasians. Far from being a relationship of equals then, I believe the Eurasians would heavily restrict and stipulate what the Church could do. Given his history of limited cooperation during the war and the stark reality of an even more domineering Eurasia, I think Pius XII would likely see the wisdom of collaboration. Perhaps the final years of his pontificate would see an internal church purge of its own. There would no doubt be many holy men opposed to the Eurasian takeover. Any centuries-old religion with its own dogma and belief in the ultimate authority of God will have trouble subordinating itself to an atheistic ideology. Many priests and bishops would no doubt be killed or herded into camps by the Eurasians themselves in the initial chaos of the conquest. Since we know Italy falls into the Eurasian orbit, we can also be reasonably sure the Vatican at least would fall into neo-Bolshevik hands. Assuming Pius had not been killed in the atomic war or fled elsewhere as the Eurasian army moved in, he would essentially have little leverage and would in essence be a Eurasian prisoner and puppet. As a quick digression, another historical support for the limited collaboration theory is the relationship between the real-world Bolsheviks and the Russian Orthodox Church. While not pretty obviously, and suffering their fair share of persecution in closed seminaries, confiscated property and clergy murdered or imprisoned, this was not the entire story. Following Barbarossa, Stalin did somewhat relent, recognizing the Orthodox Church's use in rallying the people against the invaders. While officially condemning religion then, there was a cooperation between the Communists and Orthodox Church hierarchy. However, as with my scenario in Universe, the Church was obviously heavily controlled by the state, and this policy too was far from uncontroversial within the Communist Party itself. So perhaps Pius and the smarter cardinals put up and shut up, so to speak, take their orders from their Eurasian higher-ups, and are tolerated in provinces where the proles there show a need for the Church. This may extend to the other denominations too, and of course to the Orthodox Church itself. Interestingly too, we know Turkey was under Eurasian control, which may mean that Islam too is tolerated to an extent, though I think that even a whiff of rebellion with a religious nature would likely provoke a harsh response. Perhaps in Turkey this would work though, as Ataturk essentially created a secular state in the 1920s, which may gel better with the Eurasians and which may bode well for Muslims in the territory, the Poles there potentially being able to worship in peace. Back on Pope Pius, I actually think there's a decent chance he could die a natural death on or close to the year he did in our world. He passed away in 1958, the same year we know the party ruled in Oceania. If this happened in Universe, perhaps the first post-takeover conclave would be heavily overseen by Eurasian officials. At this point, I suspect the only surviving cardinals would be heavily pro-Eurasian anyway, so perhaps another pope or two were elected going into the 60s and possibly 70s. As the regime tightens its grip, however, I think the ultimate fate of the popes and the church itself is extinction. In the end, the church and neo-Bolshevism are simply incompatible ideologically. The party rejects God and views the pope, the bishops, and the church itself as all part of an unjust and capitalist hierarchical structure, with clear potential to exercise power outside of their control. Can the party always be right if what they say is right does not chime with what the Bible says or what the Pope decrees? By the 1970s at the latest, I think the Eurasian regime would likely feel stable enough, if not long before, in crushing the final remnants of the Catholic Church and other denominations too. Whoever reigns after Pius in this world would probably be arrested for counter-revolutionary activity. He and his leading cardinals would disappear for a time and re-emerge, forever changed, ironically later revealed as willing converts to the true reality, the undeniable and infallible wisdom of Eurasia's party and its own big brother. Perhaps somewhere in Rome, an outer party member, call him Marco, spots the last pope and two of his cardinals in an ill-lit cafe. They stare blankly into nothing, tears glazing the ex-Holy Father's eyes. A chill runs up Marco's back as he notices that all three traitors have broken noses, and the former Bishop of Rome is missing the first three fingers on his right hand. Soon after this encounter, the trio are rearrested. In addition to confessing anew to their old crimes, a whole new catalogue of atrocities are added. In a special and gruesome sentence, it's decreed by Eurasia's big brother that the men will be publicly burned alive in the same manner as so many heretics in the centuries past. Yet those seemingly broken, in one final, though largely unreported act of defiance, the ex-pope's last scream as the flames engulf his broken form is for his Lord, Jesus Christ. Too late, the party have allowed the death of an unrepentant thought criminal, and a very prominent one at that. Though utterly cowed into mournful silence, soon after, the hushed voices of proles everywhere can be heard in homes, in alleyways and secret gatherings. They speak of His Holiness as the last great martyr. Will God ever send a champion to finally destroy this greatest of antichrists? So a little fan fiction-y towards the end, but still a feasible scenario nonetheless. If finally the church has served its purpose, then yes, the Pope and his leading associates would be arrested and made examples of. I could even imagine the burning scenario, given how cruel the party is in Oceania. It would also have huge propaganda value given the known history of the burning of heretics in former centuries and the obvious history of the Inquisition. What do you all think? Would it be a much quicker crushing of the entire Catholic Church from the offset? Or would the Pope possibly be allowed to remain for a time, collaborating with the Eurasians, but still eventually suffering a horrible fate? Tell us all your thoughts in the comments section. If you enjoyed this video, then consider checking out some of our other videos, especially what happened to the Queen in 1984. Please like the video too, as this really helps the channel. And remember, proles and animals are free.